Jon, I would like to ask you, what was your first art project?
My very first art project? Well, probably I was about 4 or 5 years old and I drew a picture of a rocket going to Mars. I still have it.
You still have it?
Yeah.
Then maybe this could be the picture to show in the last post for Astronomers Without Borders. Would you mind to do that?
Okay, I think I have it scanned somewhere. Sure.
Excellent. So you've always been interested in science since a very early age. And do you know what triggered?
I wouldn't say science so much as space. And for me, the question has always been not why did I become interested, but why isn't everybody interested? Because for as long as I can remember, it was just the most interesting thing I could think of. When I was little and my mother bought me an encyclopedia, the very first thing I looked up was astronomy. So, and I found that there's some areas of human pursuit where people from a very young age, musicians say, from the time they're 4 or 5, all they want to do is play music or build things. And I think that space and astronomy, it's almost as if for some people it's in our genetic code that we're born with an interest in this. And I've spoken to many people. You don't find a lot of people who really love space who weren't interested until they were in college or something. For most people who are interested in it, I think it comes very early and it's very strong. And it's just, I mean, it's like, why do you like candy? Because it tastes so good. You know, why do you like astronomy and space? Because it's so much fun to think about. All the big questions, you know, where did the world come from? What will happen to it? Are we alone? You know, will we ever be able to contact another civilization? In many fields of science, the questions, you have to have a lot of education before you can even understand the questions, because it's very technical. But there's something about astronomy where the appeal of it, I think, is clear to many, many people. You know, anybody who speaks before a public audience, you'll find that half the people, as soon as you say you're going to talk about astronomy and space, they're there. They'll listen to you for as long as you want to talk. Other people, not so much. And it's very hard to interest them. If they don't have that initial interest, it's almost like if it doesn't taste good to you from the very beginning, it's hard to develop the taste. But there's so many people who either they end up doing it professionally, they become scientists or astronauts, but for a lot more people, it's just something that they would like to know more about. One of the things I hear a lot when I talk to people is they say, well, I've always been interested in this, but I never really had the opportunity to learn more about it, but I wish I could. So the space for me came first. The art came much later. I mean, even though I drew pictures when I was little, I went for a long period when I was growing up where I really wouldn't have listed art as one of my interests. I loved reading and books, and when I started doing art when I was in university, and what I was very influenced by at that time were posters for rock bands and the new revolution in comic books that happened in the 60s and 70s with underground comics, and this kind of graphic influenced me a lot. So that's what I started to do. I started wanting to draw comic books. I wanted to do comic books for Marvel.
Jon, have you ever thought of becoming an astronaut when you were a little kid and you drew your first sketch of a space?
I don't think so. I think because where I wanted to go was so far away that, well, even now, if somebody said if you could go up to the space station, yeah, that would be interesting. I'd like to do it, but it doesn't really thrill me because you're going 200 or 300 miles away. I mean, you're farther away from me now than if I was in the space station. And really the only thing to look at is the Earth, which is very beautiful. And I guess I would like to be an astronaut from maybe 100 years from now, when you can really go places.
Do you see the future of space travel moving very much further compared to what we are doing now? Do you see this mission to Mars and other planets really happening in the future?
I don't see it happening in the near future because it's so expensive. I think the Chinese are going to become more active. I think the next people on the moon will be speaking Chinese, which is fine with me. I don't really care who does it as long as somebody does it. But again, going to the moon is such a small journey. I mean, it's a funny thing to say, but it is a very small journey. And I think that right now, with the politics and the economics of the world and the problems that we face, it's just too expensive. I mean, sending people to Mars to start a colony or to send them there to come back, hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe even $1 trillion. And I just don't think anybody would be willing to pay for it. But if you look back at how much we've seen in our lifetimes, I mean, especially mine, I'm a lot older than you are, and I was born before Sputnik. I remember when I was 9 years old and the newspaper came and it said about Sputnik. I got it and I woke up my mother, which she didn't like, but, you know. So to go from nothing to where we're now sending spacecraft like Voyager out of the solar system, it's incredible. I mean, Carl Sagan said, you only land on Mars for the first time once, right? And we saw that. You know, the first spacecraft to land on Mars, the first people to go to the moon, the first discoveries of the outer solar system and the incredible moons that are there. I mean, when I was growing up, it was all about the planets. Nobody cared about the moons very much. But now we find that the moons are maybe the most interesting places to go, maybe where there's life in the oceans in Europa, Ganymede. So I don't want to be greedy. I've seen so much that if it stops for a while, I doubt very much that I will live to see people on Mars. And I still hope to live for another 25 or 30 years. So, and in fact, at the conference that I was at, the Starship Century, I think the consensus was that for the next 50 years or so, it'll mostly be smaller steps and smaller spacecraft, because we can build them so much smaller now. Everything is so miniaturized, which is good because we still haven't solved the problem of it's very, very expensive to put 1 kilo in orbit. It costs a lot of money. So I don't think we'll see too much more with humans, but later this century, especially if we are able to get some more solution to the climate problems and the population problems and the unequal distribution of wealth. The fact that, you know, some of us are so wealthy and most of us are so poor is a very, very major problem. And people who say, well, how can you justify sending things into space when there are so many problems on Earth? There is an argument to be made, which is why I don't think anybody would or should spend $1 trillion right now. But to spend a few billion, you can still do quite a lot. And I've been totally happy with what robots have found. And you can do so much more if you don't worry about people that you have to keep alive and bring home.
Thanks, John. Do you think the idea that Carl Sagan had, that we should communicate with our neighboring planet, should be by radio? Or maybe do you envision other ways of communicating with a possible life out there?
Well, of course, this is the big question, and something I've been interested in my whole life. A couple of years ago was the 50th anniversary of Project Ozma, the first attempt by Frank Drake to listen for radio messages. It still seems like a good idea. Of course, we haven't found anything yet. The people searching would say, well, we've only searched a very, very little bit, so it's much too soon to say there are no messages. But I think we can say that there are no loud and easy messages. If it were easy to do, we would have done it already. If there was lots of radio messages going back and forth across the galaxy, I think we would have heard them. So if we haven't, it could mean we haven't looked in the right place, or we're not looking in the right way. Maybe it's not radio. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's something we haven't discovered yet. Maybe we won't discover it for another 50 years, and then when we do, we'll go, of course, well, this is how you do it. I would, if I had to make a bet, I would bet that the discovery of extraterrestrials will come from somebody who's not looking for it at all. It won't come from the people who are searching for it. It could be that we've detected the message already and it's sitting in somebody's data. Because, you know, when an astronomer makes an observation, there's the signal he's looking for and everything else is noise. So it's very possible that a message could have been just considered to be noise and discarded. So I also wouldn't be surprised if we do find something, when we go back in the records, we'll find actually if we had been smart enough, it was here, we just didn't see it.
That's beautiful. What was your collaboration with Carl Sagan like? We hear so much about the project, the Voyager records, that we didn't hear much yet about how was it collaborating with between you and Carl Sagan? How did the artist and the scientist work together? Maybe it's an interesting model for a lot of other scientists and artists out there.
I think you're right. There's a long tradition of artists and scientists working together, especially before photography, because whenever there would be an expedition, like Captain Cook's expedition to the Pacific, a very important member of the expedition was the artist that they brought aboard to draw what they would see, because you couldn't bring everything home with you. So there's a tradition of it. Some people, like Leonardo or Audubon, were both the artist and the scientist. But more often, they're different talents, and it's a perfect area for collaboration, and I still think it's a perfect area of collaboration. I think any collaboration is a relationship, and like any human relationship, it depends on the chemistry. Some people, you just, right away, you know you're on the same wavelength, and other people, you're not. So I think with Carl, from the very first, the chemistry was good, and we became very good friends. I think because we thought about things in a similar way, but coming from very different directions. So what it meant was the things we did together were things that neither of us could have done by ourselves. And with a collaboration, when you have a partner, a creative partner, and it works, it's a wonderful feeling. I mean, it's like having a dance partner where you dance very well together. So there was a feeling, you know, Gilbert and Sullivan kind of he would think of things much more in quantitative terms, and I would think of things more in visual terms. Another thing that I think made our collaboration work is that Carl had the soul of a poet. A lot of scientists are very, very down to earth. They're very literal. They're not really comfortable with metaphor, because metaphors very often are not exactly precise. That's not what they're supposed to be. It's a way of seeing it in a new way. And Carl was very comfortable with metaphor. He used it a lot in his writing. And I think the fact that I liked to use metaphor in my pictures was something that, because I often wondered, because there were many other artists he knew at the time who were doing things in space, who were very, very good artists. Don Davis and Rick Sternbach and Ron Miller and some others. And he worked with many of them, but he always seemed to like to work with me, and I think it was the fact that I approached the topic maybe a little more poetically than realistically. That was the basis of it. And, like any other relationship, if it works and you do something well, then you want more. And we stayed friends and partners for 25 years from the time we met until his death when we were working on Contact. It was difficult to work with him in the sense that he was a perfectionist, and he worked very hard, and he wasn't easily satisfied. So there were plenty of times I would do something and I'd think, this is really good, and he'd go, no, do it again, do something else. Usually, though, at the end, I was glad that he pushed me to extend my limits a little bit. And I like to think that sometimes I pushed him a little bit. For example, years before the Voyager record, one of the topics that Carl and I like to talk about was how could we communicate with an extraterrestrial? And the classic solution had been, well, math and physics are going to be the same. The periodic table is going to be the same everywhere. Prime numbers will be the same everywhere. So this is the basis for contact. But I always felt that art also used some of these universals in aesthetics. A lot of the principles that make something harmonious or beautiful to us has its roots in physics. In music, the physics of sound. The reason some notes harmonize and other notes are dissonant, it's not we learn to hear it that way. It's that if you look at how the waves work, some waves cancel each other out, some waves blend. And it's physics that determines that. Yet that's what we find beautiful. So it seemed to me that if you're going to say ETs will have physics that we can understand, then I thought, well, maybe ETs will have art that we can understand. And I think that was a kind of a new idea that that hadn't really been explored as seriously as I think it was later. And I think the idea of sending music at all, I mean, you might think, why send music? It's so human that it won't mean anything to anybody else. But to say, well, there's some things in music that do express human emotions, it's very human, but there are other things in music like the structure of a fugue, which is very logical. And you don't need to know anything about Earth or people to understand the pattern in a fugue. And if we find the way Bach makes that pattern somehow satisfying, then maybe ETs will also find it satisfying for the same reason. So I think that encouraged Carl a little bit to think about what's the point of sending music into space. And it's also, I think, one of the reasons that he asked me to be on the team. And in fact, that's kind of what I saw my role as, trying to look at the material we were sending from the point of view of how will this communicate? Because with something like the Voyager record, there are really two audiences. The extraterrestrials, who may find it a million years from now, you don't know, maybe not. But then the contemporary audience on Earth, who's going to hear about it and get excited about it and think about it. And I would have to say that I think that that Carl and some of the other people on the team were more concerned with what the message would say to Earth. And that was really very, very important, because one of the things we wanted to say is we're one planet. So the message comes from everybody, not just Americans, not from NASA, but to try to make it as inclusive as possible. Very, very important message. So the message to Earth was very important, and I'm not saying they did anything wrong in concentrating on that. But I think that Frank Drake and I, with what we were doing, were thinking more in terms of, could this be understood? If we look at two pictures, if I never saw a picture of a human being doing this, could I understand it? is the foreground and the background clearly separated? Is one thing and behind another thing, and well, maybe you don't think it's behind it, maybe if there's somebody behind you holding out his arm, I know it's another person, but if I'd never seen it, I might think you had an arm growing out of your head. So, looking at things, trying to look at things from an extraterrestrial perspective was a challenge, and in a funny kind of way, I think more an artistic challenge than a scientific one.
Jon, what is the art project out of all of your art projects that you are more attached to, that you found most interesting to work towards?
Well, I've been so lucky in doing so many really interesting projects. It's hard to pick one. The Voyager record has to be very special because, you know, artists want immortality, and here's something I made that's going to last for 1,000 million years. I mean, what can be better than that? So that's in a class by itself. But I've also had the chance to try to design a warning marker for nuclear waste that would last for 10,000 years and prevent people in the future from poisoning themselves accidentally. Very interesting project. As an artist, I think the biggest artistic success that I feel from everything I've done is probably the Galaxy Garden. I guess because it grew in my mind for really starting in 1981. That's when I first started thinking about it, and then it was opened in 2007. So that's more than 20 years. 25 years, 26 years of thinking about project, and it's something I couldn't have done if I hadn't done everything else beforehand. The painting I did of the map of the galaxy for the Air and Space Museum, which was another huge project, but a very necessary project to do before you do the Galaxy Garden. I think the hardest thing to be in art is original, because unlike technology, art changes, but it doesn't make old art obsolete. What I mean is, as technology changes, you use iron, but then you figure out steel, and steel is better, so you don't use iron anymore. And then you figure out how to build with titanium, and you don't use steel, you use titanium. So one technology replaces another technology. And when we look at an old train or an old tool, it's of interest historically, but you can say the new planes, the new airplanes, are better than the old ones. They fly higher, faster, longer, safer. But with art, you look at the cave paintings from 25,000 years ago, and they're as good as any drawings of animals done today. So when you do art, you're not only competing and comparing yourself with all your contemporaries, but with every other artist who ever lived. So it gets harder and harder to do anything that's original. And I do think that the Galaxy Garden is an original idea. And it's a kind of original idea that when people hear about it, they say, why didn't I think of that? Or why didn't anybody think of that sooner? And I take that as a real compliment, because it means there's something, you can do brand new things. It's easy to be original if it doesn't have to be good. I mean, every novel is original in the sense that the words haven't been written in that order before, but just being original doesn't matter if it's not interesting, if it's not beautiful, if it isn't something that makes people go, of course, I understand it immediately. They get it right away. So for me, the garden was a kind of culmination of all of my work as an artist. And kind of ironically, as most artists of the late 20th century and 21st century moved from old-fashioned media and techniques to the new ones, digital techniques in all of the arts. that to go back to something that was as far from computers as is possible to be, which is a garden. I mean, it was digital only in the sense that we call our hands digits. And those were the only digits used in the garden. And I'm a little concerned about the way that digital technology has so completely overwhelmed everything else. I mean, it's wonderful technology, and I use it, but it's not the only technology. And in some ways, older technologies maybe were a little more reliable, or at least a little easier to understand. So I like the idea of doing something that had nothing to do with computers. It was a different way of approaching the problem. How do you teach people about what a galaxy is? Because most people don't know what a galaxy is, really. But how do you do it in a way that makes it an aesthetic experience, not just an intellectual experience?
Talking about technology, my last question is, if there was already the technology available, what kind of artwork would you make? Have you ever thought of something that cannot be realized now because the technology is not available yet? Or perhaps you would like to use something, some technology very traditional, but what is the most radical idea you have at the moment, if you want to share it with us?
Well, I'm very excited right now about the whole idea of 3D printing. You know, in Star Trek they have the replicator. Well, this is the first version. This is Replicator 1.0. That we can use 3D printing to make things that would have been very, very difficult to make before. For example, models of protein molecules. That's the first place I ever saw 3D printing done, at the Scripps Institute in San Diego. With molecules, the way they're shaped is very, very important in understanding their function. And the shapes are very, very difficult to actually make. So people had to look at them in projection as a 2D drawing of trying to do a 2D drawing of a three-dimensional object. And even if you have a drawing on a screen that you can turn in 3 dimensions, it's still not the same of holding it in your hands and inspecting it. So the fact that we can make 3D models of things that would have been impossible to make before, I think is very exciting. And I think that we're at the stage with those as we were with the first personal computers back in the early 70s. You know, we're just seeing the beginning of what these things are capable of doing. And I have no doubt that probably already it's happening, that artists are working with 3D modelers to create fantastic, fantastic new things. If I had to point to a technology, that would be one I would point to. The other would be nanotechnology. The idea that we can make things so small. There's a wonderful movie. It might have been that you posted it on Facebook. I'm not sure where I got it, but people at IBM made a movie just by moving atoms, literally moving atoms around, and they made a little animation. I thought that was fantastic. Just fantastic. And there's always been a fascination with miniaturization. Like I remember I saw a show at an art gallery in Toronto years ago of miniature portraits back in the 1700s and 1800s before photography. If you wanted to have a picture of your loved one to take with you, you know, you made a very, very small locket. You wear it around your neck. And they're beautiful miniatures. It's unbelievable. With no technology, or with very, very simple technology, the miniaturization that could be done by artists. And nanotechnology allows this miniaturization. I mean, you're literally writing the Bible on the head of a pin or something like that. And that's another area where I think people are going to be doing incredible things. And also, the idea of maybe the ultimate miniaturization is molecular of people putting things in the genetic code. If you take the sequences of proteins and you make them stand for different letters, you can actually write things, and somebody has made a molecule that contains the Shakespearean sonnet. It's like a little stretch of RNA or something like that, where if you decode it, it makes a Shakespearean sonnet. And I think that the convergence of nanotechnology and biochemistry and 3D printing are all going to come together to make things that artists will come up with that will be new and original, and it's just fantastic.
Thanks, John. I can hear some birds in the background.
Yes.
It makes me feel we are in the Galaxy Garden right now. Thank you so much. I hope we'll be able to talk again during the Hangout in perhaps in June. And thanks on behalf of all Astronomers Without Borders.
Well, I think it's a wonderful organization. Thank you so much for including me. And yes, I look forward to doing the Hangout. Just let me know. I'm free all of June, pretty much. So just let me know what works for you and Kimberly and the other people.
Great. Thanks, John.